Astropsych 400, podcast for sleep. It's time to go to sleep now. Time to surround yourself with positive vibes. You are who you are. Being weird is not a crime. Is dreaming good for you? What type of dreaming would you want to experience? Some people think that the dreams at night help you fall asleep and stay asleep and keep you in bed for 8 hours so that your brain can focus on something else while your body is trying to rejuvenate. However, when it comes to daydreams, some people think that every single form of a daydream is bad. They view these daydreams as temptations that should be avoided, and that any time you get lost in your imagination, that's bad, because it is a distraction from the present, and it is also leading you away from solving your current problems. One way to practice staying in the present is just to be aware of it, closing one's eyes and focusing on the current moment, listening to all the sights and sounds that are around you, thinking about everything that is currently happening, whether it is a car driving by the window, or perhaps the sound of the wind rattling against something off in the distance, and just focusing on what is currently happening. Daydreams can be very practical because they allow us to experience bursts of creativity, and they can often lead to the inspiration for creative projects. I would expect that many short stories, novels, and poems have been written because of something that was created from a daydream. However, I frequently cite the statement on Astropsych 400 that there is a correlation between creativity and deviant behavior, especially among young males. Between the ages of 16 and 25, there is a pure correlation between creativity and deviant behavior, reaching its zenith around age 20 or 21, meaning that when people are experiencing their peak years of creativity, they're also experiencing their peak years of deviant, problematic, and sometimes even criminal behavior. What really is the correlation between daydreaming and the destructive ways of thinking? Is it just lack of awareness, or is it just recognizing that you are not who you think you are? And that is why people have been discouraged to participate in daydreaming, because it can be divided into somewhat of an odd dichotomy. You're either telling yourself that you're better than someone, or you're telling yourself that you're not as good as you thought you were before. You're putting yourself down. Is this true? I began to think about this type of thought process for a while, and I really began to agree with it. I found it so surprising that I did indeed agree with it, that when you get lost in your imagination, and not talking about slaying dragons in your mind or anything like that, but when you begin to think about the people whom you know in your personal life, when you begin to think about all the individuals whom you correspond with and communicate with and interact with on a daily basis, and you start thinking about them in your imagination during a daydream, yes, indeed, it almost always is that you're either putting yourself down or you're telling yourself that you're better than someone else, and that type of thinking can lead to some inappropriate outcomes, because that can make somebody angry, or it can also make somebody arrogant. However, with the concept of false dichotomies always in play, I think that any statement like that can be manipulated to a certain extent, or that people can force a false dichotomy on someone, and there almost certainly would be exceptions that prove the rule. Daydreams are often referred to as something called reveries. I'm not even completely sure how this works, so I don't want to state too much, but there's a musical act out there called Lacuna Coil that had a album out called In a Reverie, and one of their songs had a particular line that stayed with me for a very long time, and it said, "Nothing wrong in my fantasy world." And I think a lot of people between the ages of 16 and 25 truly can comprehend that, or that they can learn how to be at peace with themselves in the process of imagination. There's a very famous story out there called The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, where somebody is just living this alternate life in his own imagination. And I remember there was an incident that happened to me when I was roughly 19 years old. I was in college, and I was someone who wanted to drink lots of alcohol in college, and believe it or not, the people around me really did not. They were much more cautious with their drinking because they have something that is called social awareness. They could recognize that their behavior is bothering people when they were intoxicated, but I chose to ignore all of that, so I became somewhat of an annoying party goer, and I got rather intoxicated very easily, and I just spent the majority of the night sitting on the couch with my hand on the palm, well, all the palm of my hand on my face, rather, and I would remember that I was just thinking about all of these imaginary sequences, and it was so much fun, just the ways that your mind can go to places, because through the process of creativity and imagination and daydreams, we are very much aware that we can go beyond the abilities that we have in the material world. And even Jackie Chan, the film star, said that one of the reasons why he had always wanted to do an animated series when he launched Jackie Chan Adventures, which was on the now defunct WB, which was taken over by the CW, but he wanted to be a cartoon character, and he wanted a cartoon that was based on him, because he said that cartoons can do things that a real life human being cannot. Your imaginary sequences can do things that real life cannot. And I really began to wonder, everybody's just looking at me and they're just thinking that I am not a good person, or that I'm a drag, or that I'm irresponsible, or I'm not contributing to the well-being of the other partygoers. But it was such a big temptation indeed, because based on all of the imaginary sequences that I went through, I was probably having the best time out of anybody there, and I find that a little bit surprising, but I also find out that a lot of people really do not want to strive after their chosen desired goals and pathways and achieving success. And this is something that I think really does relate to imagination and creativity. And also, if it's going to be about creativity, I'm reminded of a quotation from the musician Victor Wooten, when he said that he is not any more creative than anybody else, it's just a matter of going there. And some people want to just live in this imaginary world and do not do anything in the external world, the secret life of Walter Mitty, or me being half asleep at a party, so to speak. And if you achieve a certain level of contentment, I don't see what the problem would be. But other people want to live like that, and they do not want to achieve any certain level of anything. And what they choose to do instead is they want to just sit around and have other people do things for them. And even if it's a very simple task, instead of just solving the problem, they will just constantly ask somebody else to fix the problem for them. Maybe it stems from their upbringing, or it stems from how they interacted with their parents. Maybe their mother did a lot of things for them between the ages of 0 and 4, and they never learned how to tie their own shoes until they were 9 years old, so to speak. But that just ties back to getting lost in your imagination and putting other people down, or thinking that you're better than somebody else. And one practical mental exercise that I have used in terms of dealing with getting lost in one's own imagination is to never judge yourself. And it is amazing how just a few moments of mental clarity can allow you to see that you should never judge yourself. And when you ever say, I am a bad person, no, do not say that. And I began to think, okay, well, what can I say instead of I am a bad person? I did something that hurt someone's feelings once, and I recognized that I shouldn't have said that. And then all of a sudden, all of the barriers are gone. All of the cloud of guilt and inappropriate feeling has been lifted because now I understand that. They sound so much simpler, and you're not trying to bring in this deeply held spiritual belief onto somebody else's situation, and you're not trying to interpret how somebody else is feeling or thinking. Instead, you just recognize that these are the actions that you did, and this is how you felt about it then, and this is how you feel about it now. And I think that once you begin to stop saying, I'm a bad person or I'm a good person, but instead, I'm a free thinking individual who makes observations and I make decisions and I try my best and I try not to do anything that is hurtful to other people. Once you begin to look at life as a process as opposed to just immediately attributing good and bad to your actions, everything becomes much clearer. And there is another song out there from the Butthole Surfers, a name which people do not like too much, but it's called Pepper, and it says, you never know just how you look through other people's eyes. And so much of that is true because the way that other people perceive you might not be the way that you feel about yourself, and the way that you perceive other people might not be the way that they feel about themselves. So it can be rather difficult for us to attribute any single type of belief system to another person. Excellent examples of this would be being half asleep at the party and everybody thinks that you're boring, or somebody who is spending all of their life daydreaming and everyone thinks that they don't do anything or that they're having a bad time or that they are not experiencing life, when in reality I'm sure that person believes that they are experiencing life, just not as physically as other people are. And I think that there comes a certain time when people really have major changes in terms of daydreaming and imagination. If it is solely about imagination, then I think that it can be viewed as a part of the stages in life, because I truly remember that I held on to a lot of my childhood imagination up until perhaps my late teens or early 20s, and I would have these sequences that would take place because I had this type of imaginary world that I liked to live in, but what was truly interesting was I could take myself in and bring myself out, and I would just think about what people would call fictional characters, except I didn't write them down in any particular story. Instead, I would just think about sequences that would happen with them, stories in my own mind. Some people call that daydreaming, other people call them childhood imagination. And I noticed that the older that I got into my teen years, the less that I was involved with the particular stories, and that there would be all of these characters that I had created, these personas that I had created, and they would just live out their lives in my imaginary world. And I really began to think that they became so detailed it was hard to believe that they were not even real. But as I turned 15 and 16 and 17 and 18, I was almost not involved with any of their stories at all. And by the time I turned to 18 years old, I noticed that I began to think about imaginary sequences that dealt with people who were mostly real, like interacting with celebrities or real life situations, thinking about myself as a musician and what would happen if I met other musicians and we were living in a house together and we were writing music together, as opposed to the stuff from my teen years when I was mostly thinking about fictional characters who were slaying dragons in some type of fantasy kingdom. And then I spent my youth thinking about some very similar things, like the ages of about 5 or 6, all the way till about 13. Just very gentle things. Like, I would watch a TV show, and then I would think about how I would respond to that if I had been in that situation, or if I had one of the characters that I have created, which I've never shared with anyone before. How would they respond to these types of like situations in the TV show? And it didn't matter what kind of show it was, whether it was The Simpsons or the Flintstones, or maybe a movie, maybe something like the Titanic. Like, how would these characters that I had created, how would they solve the problems that were featured in these fictional stories? So I think there was a certain value in that because it was just something entertaining, and it also goes to show you the basic concept of being a hero and how I had these types of imaginary heroes, because that is why they were entertaining and that is why they were likable, and that really shows you that there were types of definitions of goodness that can be achieved in somebody's own mind, because these characters could always save the day. Again, no matter how tricky the situation was, they would always find a way to solve it, because they weren't real and they could do things that were larger than life. I heard something recently about the fictional detective Sherlock Holmes, and I was listening to it on a podcast, and somebody said just that. Sherlock Holmes is an entertaining fictional character because he's not real. And the way that the stories in the Sherlock Holmes books written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle work is that no matter how good an earthly detective is, Sherlock Holmes is always one step beyond them. He's one step greater. He's one step more capable. He can see things that the greatest human detective cannot. He can figure out things that the greatest human detective cannot. And even if that isn't a perfect interpretation, or maybe that's not exactly how Sir Arthur Conan Doyle intended, we can't ask him, he's dead. I think that that is a very insightful statement, and a very insightful and valuable observation. And we can do this from time to time. When we begin to start thinking about things in a different way, we can see things in a different way. And this brings up the concept of consulting one's mind, because when you try to rationalize what you're thinking and you get lost in your imagination, this can lead to self-justification. And self-justification is very, very difficult. I was watching the show Bel-Air this year, which is the reboot of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and it has the same characters, just in a more dramatic context. And they talked about the concept of self-justification, where one character named Jeffrey said to a character named Uncle Phil, "You always do this. You always say that you don't want to do something because it's against your principles. Then you don't fix the problem. You act like you're trapped. You act like your back is against the wall. And then you end up doing the thing anyway. And you just are trying to self-justify it." And that would be a very basic concept of consulting one's mind. And you can find reasons why you should be doing things. There's even a meme with Bilbo Baggins that says, "After all, why shouldn't I keep the ring," so to speak? And that is exactly it. People can find reasons if they think about something over and over again. And I definitely believe that this whole concept of getting lost in your imagination or getting lost in a daydream can be a bad thing. But I also think that if you're going to confront the problem, you can lead with the sword or lead with the olive branch. And when people lead with the sword, they are often going to create a new problem, and they're going to create a problem that wasn't there before. When they lead with the olive branch and the sign of peace, there is a different way to go about it. And I heard this on another TV show as well. Somebody said that if you're trying to communicate a message with someone, you can rule them with an iron fist, or you can show them through love and consideration. And yes, I'm paraphrasing, but those are the basic words, because I remember back in my early 20s even, one family member would notice that I'm just sitting around a lot, and what he said was that when you just sit around a lot, the same thought goes in your mind over and over again. And he was completely right, because I spent a lot of my life daydreaming, and I would often think about these imaginary sequences over and over again, and the same ones. And the reason why is because it is comforting. Even young children in preschool and kindergarten find it comforting when the teacher does the lesson the same way every time, like starting with a song and then sitting down in a circle, and then you get up and you do an arts and craft activity. They would find it very entertaining. So it is not only entertaining, but it's also comforting, because it creates a sense of security. And when children are thinking about imaginary sequences, they can think about the same thing over and over again and not get bored. I really did this all the way into my early 20s, and I think part of me, though, even as somebody who was much younger, maybe in my, I don't know, in teen years, maybe even back to the age of 9 or 10, when I would think about imaginary sequences, I would want to think about them over and over again, because I wanted to get the story right, always just making sure that I understood every single one of the details. And part of me truly wanted to say that I had created some type of alternate universe within the powers of my own imagination, and I wanted to know all the ins and outs of it. However, by now I recognize that there were just alternate timelines and inconsistencies, and I'm thinking about this one character who was a professional BMX biker, but he was also an Olympic rower, and he got the rubber for his bike tires from the Amazon, and maybe he got the wood for his rowing horse from the Amazon too. Well, I don't know. See, I just made that up. I mean, like, but he definitely got the rubber for the bike tires from the Amazon, and they weren't black. They were this beige color. But then he was also a scientist, and you can see that it just jumps all around. And I think that a lot of that stemmed from just wanting to create characters that had the ability to do things that I could not, and they could solve problems that I could not. And this is heavily exemplified by the film Welcome to Marwen, that features Steve Carell when he has all of these imaginary sequences about characters that he creates with dolls and action figures, and talking about how he believes that they are supposed to keep him safe. But that movie could have been so much better, because if it had just focused on the creator of the projects as opposed to making little stories about the projects themselves, it would have been a much more entertaining movie. But one cannot be too critical, and that's exactly it, though. That's the reason why you shouldn't be too critical, because that's leading with the sword and not the olive branch. That is using the iron fist and not the pathway of love and concern. That is the actual word that I was trying to remember, not love and compassion, and not love and consideration. When you are approaching somebody with a problem and you recognize that there is a problem with them, you can rule them with an iron fist, or you can use the pathway of love and concern. You show them that there is love and concern. I heard something interesting that is getting away from the daydream angle, but I hope you're fast asleep right now. And that is that the way that you control people is that you put them in a mental prison. The way that other people want to control you is by putting you in a mental prison, and you manipulate the pain and pleasure principle. And my interpretation of this is that people will tell you that they're being mean to you for your own good. They will tell you that they are being nice to you for your own good. But no matter what they do, they have the power to do so. And not only that, they are doing what you need. You need them to behave in this certain way, or you will literally die. Not a want, not a desire, not a like. You will die if you don't have them in your life. That is what they will tell you, and that is how people will control you. They say that this is what you need, and if you don't have me in your life, you will destroy yourself. And it's all about power and manipulation. And people recognize that a lot of things are about power and manipulation, and that's why they turn to daydreaming. Because As Nellie Mackay once said, you can hear what's on my lips, but you don't know what's in my mind. And that is something that cannot be controlled. And there's even a scene in the movie Bach's Fight for Freedom when Bach is trying to create new types of music, Johann Sebastian Bach, the composer that is, and somebody knocks over all of his sheet music and he tears and crumples up some of it, and then Bach just sits down and on the piano or the organ, I forget which one it was, and he starts playing again, and he says something to the effect of, "You can't take what's in here," and he's pointing to his brain, or his head, his mind. "You can't take what's in here," and I'm totally paraphrasing that because it's been like 20 years since I've watched that movie, more like 22 or 23 years, I'm so old now. But that's the whole point, though. That's why people turn to these types of mental outlets, because it becomes one of the only refuges where things are purely uncorrupted. And once people begin to share things with other people, then they insult them and they say nasty things, because people are very mean and cruel and nasty to each other. But there are some ways to respond to that. And the first is that you can eliminate toxic people from your life. The second is you can try and understand toxic people so that you can get the advantage, like about how they're trying to put you in the mental prison, about how they're trying to manipulate the pain and pleasure principle and saying that their destructive behavior is what you need, otherwise you will not be able to exist in the world. Then, I mean, I'm just curious if anyone is like somehow listening to this in dreamland, if they've ever experienced anybody like that. But I think that also that we can find that once you begin to understand the manipulation tactics, you can respond to them in a more appropriate way. It's like once you know that it's just a facade, you can think about it differently. Once you realize that the magician doesn't have magical powers and he's just a performance artist and this is how he is doing it, and oh, he slipped it into a secret compartment, then life becomes much easier to understand. And daydreaming perhaps can be good in some ways. It can be beneficial in some ways for those who want to use it in a creative and artistic way, and the inspirations that come from that particular type of thinking. But with the whole concept of judgment, over analyzing daily life, or just not being aware of the present, I do think that is bad. And I think that all of this can lead to mental toughness and mental fortitude. And those are the things that I've been trying to do this year when it talks about, when people talk about, if there is something that you don't want to do because it makes you uncomfortable, just going ahead and doing it. Oh, I don't want to go to that social event wearing this type of shirt. Oh, well, I'll do it anyway. It might look weird, but I'm going to do it. Just because people say that is how you improve your mental toughness and your mental fortitude. And this is actually advised by somebody, I think it was something that I heard from the legend Scott Adams when he said, once a day do something conventionally embarrassing so you won't be too hurt when people call you out on certain types of behavior, or you won't get embarrassed in the future. And Dr. Robert Glover also advises people 3 times a day, ask somebody to do something for you that you could do yourself, to practice assertiveness. And I always like strategies. And right now, I've just been trying to just do things that that I wouldn't normally do when I'm thinking that, oh, I don't want to do this because it doesn't make me feel all warm and fuzzy. And this is kind of a way, the daydream category. But back when I was in my early 20s, I decided that social interactions were supposed to be pleasant and enjoyable. And if it made me feel bad, then I didn't want to do it because I thought it was defeating the purpose of the social interaction. Like, it makes me feel bad to go to this party or gathering or talk to this particular person, so I'm not going to do it. But then I realized that so much of human behavior is just confronting conflict as opposed to running away from it. Or I always insisted that it's not running away from it. I would find these justifications, right? Self-justification. And I would say, you're not running from your problems, you're walking around them. If you were in the jungle and you walk into a pit of quicksand, are you just going to dive right in and say, no, I have to confront the problem? No, you'd walk around it. If you're walking in a field and you see a giant bonfire, are you just going to walk through it and say, no, I have to confront the problem? No, you'd walk around it. And I think that I'm at the point in life now where I can recognize that you can have both. You can confront the things that are bothering you, but you can also stay away from the things that will hurt you. And this is why I'm going to share some of this in a future episode, but there is approach anxiety and there is approach stupidity. Approach anxiety meaning that you just feel that overwhelming feeling of uncertainty or insecurity or even fear of doing something. Approach stupidity. Some things you shouldn't do because they will fail miserably, like walking into the pit of quicksand, walking into a bonfire. Or maybe just a more realistic example, approaching somebody whom you don't know and saying something obnoxious, and maybe just someone who is running their mouth about things that are intentionally hurtful to other people, walking up to someone and insulting them. Some people try to justify this by saying, I have a right to free speech, I have the right to say what I want, and if other people don't like it, it's their problem. But that leads to a lot of very mean and rude and unfriendly behavior and undesirable behavior, and the people who behave like that don't really have any strong social relationships, and people don't actually want them around. It's really quite to the contrary. They want nothing to do with them. They just don't know how to get rid of them because of what? Well, they don't want to confront the conflict. They just don't know how to get rid of the person because of their own anxieties. So to end the subject of daydreaming, I think that it can be a safe refuge, but it shouldn't be overdone. It can be something that is valuable, but it shouldn't be the only thing in somebody's life, and it should never be used for judging people or for projecting someone's own insecurities into some type of fantasy world where they get to win all of the time. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you are fast asleep. I hope that you will have nothing but excellent dreams. See you in the morning. Good night.